Chapter 2. Night had fallen by the time they'd collected a supply of hard firewood that would burn hot enough. Deep in the forest, they'd dug a pit, lined it with stones, and made a bed of tinder. Dare watched Kelin lower the medallion onto it with Sigurd's tongs. She shivered in the cool air. A few others had come to watch, but most had remained inside with their doors closed. Donley's father had taken the body out on the rig he used to haul trees, and had left it for the wilderness to devour. Her stomach had been twisting all evening, but she found she could finally breathe out as the fire rose. Donley stacked on more logs. She stared hard, but the flames blurred together and she couldn't see the snake anymore. She heard footsteps crunching on dried leaves behind her, and looked to see her father approaching. Riordan cut an impressive figure for a farmer, with broad shoulders and a sharp chin. His once dark hair and beard had faded to salt and pepper. He beckoned. She glanced back at the fire and its glow on Donley, Avice, and Kelin's faces. She couldn't remember seeing them so pale before. Dare felt the flames bright on her back as she turned and approached her father, but he walked ahead into the darkness. She followed him across the river and up the hill to their barn. He picked up a torch, pressed it against the outside wall, and struck his flint with his dagger until it caught. He lifted it and looked at her.
I know you've always wanted what I never did, so this is your chance to prove it to yourself.
She shook her head. It's not that. I just want to come up with the plan that saves the day. A flicker of a smile graced his face.
Unfortunately, this isn't such an opportunity. But you're the only one I trust.
He opened the door and disappeared inside. She followed as if she were tiptoeing barefoot over chips of glass. He gave her the torch and walked ahead. She saw their pony dozing next to the wagon they'd be using to pull in the bushels from the fields starting this week. The barn was wide and tall, housing all their farming tools, and still had enough space to store grain for the winter. Overgrown shadows of sharpened scythes undulated in the torchlight. She shivered. She wasn't used to the barn like this. Riordan bent low in a corner, picking at layers of loose hay. He uncovered a wooden chest. Dare saw 2 crests emblazoned on it, which must have shone brilliantly once. She recognized the crossed yellow rose and sword as the shield of Saxen, but she did not know to whom the falcon belonged. Her father rested his fingers on the symbols for a moment, then he wiped away the dust and opened the chest. To her surprise, it was unlocked. He raised a sword from it, and she hopped back as if he were lifting it from a coffin. The blade needed care, as witnessed by a slight glaze of rust, but the metal hadn't dulled with age. The design was simple, and Dare saw the Saxon shield on either side of the guard. He held it out to her. She gripped the handle and, not expecting the weight, almost dropped it. Dare cursed herself. She knew how much a sword weighed. She raised it up to meet her gaze. It was a blade of quality, and it far surpassed the short sword Sigurd had made at Riordan's request to protect the farm. Her hands had weathered many calluses from practicing with them. As she stared at the sword, Riordan reached down and lifted a belt and sheath from the chest. He closed the lid and set them atop the box. His voice was low.
I will write a letter to Count Calloway tonight, and you will take it tomorrow.
Her lips parted, and her eyes widened, but she said nothing.
We don't know anything about this outlaw, he continued. But if priests of a malevolent deity are after him, I do not want him hiding here.
Dare tried to gulp, but her mouth was suddenly too dry. A dark god? Here? She blinked to focus her vision. That's what the medallion meant? Riordan nodded.
Our village militia is young, and largely trained by you, and I wish I were joking. We need the Count to know we're defenseless.
I heard his voice. He frowned.
The priest spoke to you?
She shook her head. Then her blurred and rust-scarred reflection on the sword captured her gaze, and she hoped it was the unsteady light making her appear so pale. She realized, the only way I will get answers is if I go. About this outlaw, about this god, who must have mistaken me for someone else. But that thought settled uneasily. Gods weren't supposed to get such things wrong. She bobbed her head. I'll take the letter. Riordan exhaled.
Good. Just...
He set a hand on her shoulder.
I know. Old father moment. But stay safe, be smart, and it's all right to kick a bastard in the shins if you need to.
She huffed a chuckle, but didn't feel it in her smile. He lifted his hand.
I'll see you in the morning.
She nodded and watched him leave the barn. Dare tried the belt on, and as she expected, it was too big. She slung it over her shoulder and tested drawing the blade that way. The sword kept slipping lower as she increasingly leaned farther back to reach it, until she tripped over her own feet. This isn't going to work, she decided. She lifted the belt over her head and returned everything to the chest. Then she dragged it over near the door. The darkness didn't slow her as she ran down the lane toward River's Bridge. She had long since memorized every stone and bump on the path. The only sounds were the river's babbling and the singing crickets, while the only light was from the stars. No one could afford to waste candles or oil, so the townsfolk went to bed when the sun ducked under the horizon. At least, on normal evenings. She'd hoped the fire had already melted the medallion and that everyone had returned home by now. It was a trek to and from her farm, after all. She skidded as she misjudged the distance to the side of the miller's house and smacked hard against it. She pushed herself upright and darted around to the rear, where she banged on the wall until someone on the other side hit back. Taking the cue, she jogged to the front of the house. Kelin hung in the door wearing a nightshirt.
More riders had better be here.
Even better. Dare bounced on her toes. I'm leaving! She heaved for breath and tried to recount everything her father had said in one shot. She rocked back to the balls of her feet. And you're heading out for the guild in Dulingar?
Not tomorrow, Dare. And maybe I'll go even later because I'm missing my sleep.
He shut the door on her nose. Kelin rested against the closed door and listened to Dare jog away. He counted his breaths and then slipped outside himself, quivering against the chilly breeze. He was still in his nightshirt, and his boots were untied. He wandered to the forge and scowled when he saw candlelight underneath the door. He was hoping it would have been empty, so he could smash things against the anvil. He was owed that after today. When he pushed it open, he found Sigurd glaring down at his tabletop. 2 candles glowed next to him. The old smith swiveled his gaze over to him.
I doubt you've seen a ghost.
No. Kelin stepped inside and closed the door.
It ain't like you to do more work than you're asked.
Sigurd waved his hand toward the cold forge.
So why are you here?
Kelin caught him staring with scrutiny, even suspicion. So he demanded,
Why are you?
Sigurd shrugged.
Sleep is a younger man's game.
The silence prodded Kelin on. Dare's leaving. He moved farther inside.
It seems the whole of the kingdom is out hunting this outlaw and she's walking into it.
He sat on the anvil.
I could go with her, but why bother? It's not like guild recognition means anything out here. This is home. It's always been safe here."
"Today was safe, was it?"
Kelin stiffened.
"What would have happened if those other riders hadn't ran him through?"
Sigurd growled.
"Dare's forged for things that River's Bridge can't offer. But she ain't faced a man trying to kill her before."
Kelin's fingers pulled up a horseshoe. He'd had to make quite a few of them lately with the jousts going on in the meadow. Her idea, too. Now she was leaving. They'd been infants together. They'd grown up as brother and sister. She was his sister more than some of his younger actual sisters. He said, "Her father may be sending her off, but Dare wouldn't go if she didn't want to." Sigurd nodded. He tapped his fingers on the table as his expression became distant.
"Long, long time ago, when Might and the Merciful's armies of Palans fought in the Chentum Wars."
"I already know about Palans."
"Right. So after the fall of the Empire, our ancestors fled to this continent."
"Where are you going with this?"
Kelin's patience slipped a little further away from him.
"I'm just saying that Derora has the right to leave, and fight, and starve, and be crippled or hacked to death if she so chooses. The Empire was slain, but her ideals are still limping along."
Sigurd pointed at him.
"What about you? What do you stand for?"
After a moment, Kelin shook his head.
"I don't know."
Sigurd's chuckle was rough.
"I remember when you first became my apprentice and you flinched at the sparks when the hammer struck."
The younger man scowled.
"Not anymore."
"Of course not. But the world is full of sparks."
Kelin watched the smith rise and walk over to his prized possession, a large safe he had crafted years ago. It was a symbol of pride more than anything. At least, that's what Kelin had always thought, but he was no longer sure. Sigurd fished the key from his pocket and removed the lock with delicate precision. Kelin tried to peek over his shoulder, but the old man was too large. The smith turned around, holding a sword across his palms. It had a long handle and a smooth, slightly curved blade with a plain square guard. Only one edge was sharpened, but it was keen. Sigurd's expression remained grim.
"Your hammer isn't enough to hit the world with. You'll need a proper blade, too."
Kelin pointed.
"You didn't sharpen the backside."
"It's not supposed to be."
Sigurd tensed.
"I hadn't intended to give this to you, but you'll need it more than I ever will."
His eyes glossed over as he sighed.
"I saw a sword like this once, long ago in the capital on a brightly clothed warrior from a distant land."
He snorted.
"Anyway, I wanted his sword, and I am a smith, so I made one."
It, looks like a sound blade."
Kelin tilted his head.
"But how do you wield it?"
"It is a sound blade. I wouldn't make anything else. As far as wielding it goes, ask Dare. Now get out of my forge. You'll need sleep."
He tossed a plain sheath, designed for the curved blade, onto the table. Kelin walked home with his arms loaded. River's Bridge was as still as an undisturbed pond. It gave him time to think of how suddenly his life was changing. But it wouldn't, he told himself. He'd come right back.